unions may raise supplier power and diminish profit potential. Bankruptcy rules out failing companies to reorganize rather than exits can lead to excess capacity and intense rivalry. Government operates on multiple levels through many different policies, each of which will affect structure in different ways. So remember the original paper written in 1979. So like all academic papers, it received its criticism. So one of the key criticisms was, of course, well, what about law? Law should be a sixth force. So this is that address in 2008 where he updated his 1979 paper. So whilst most lawyers are trained to advise our clients simply in terms of how the law will impact on them directly, most of the strategic management literature suggests that in addition to this, we think about the implications for those other industry forces. So for example, how might a new law not just directly impact on my client, but on my client relative to its competitors? As we said in module 2 with step 2, the strategy canvas, different businesses in the same industry commonly prioritize different customer needs. And because of that, they'll pursue different strategies as step 3, and they'll always have a different mix of key assets step 4, different people, different real estate, different locations, different hardware, software, agreements with third parties, mix of IP, processes, and so on. Consequently then, because these businesses look so different internally, the same law can have different implications on different businesses in the same industry. And a new law or regulation that at first appears to be a costly nuisance for a client to comply with could maybe provide that client with some sort of competitive advantage if it finds it easier or cheaper to comply with than the competition. Of course, everything is relative. So let's say, for example, there's a new minimum wage law that looks like it's going to raise the cost of every business within an industry. That law will have less of an impact on a business that's always relied on having automated manufacturing plants and processes in place to keep its costs down than it will perhaps on a competitor that's always relied on having a cheap workforce to keep its costs down. And this is true in terms of any law. People often say the law, that's one thing that impacts on businesses in the same way, but it never will, not unless they're startups with hardly any assets. Otherwise, they'll operate quite differently internally. Perhaps a new strict privacy law. Where does the business currently hold its data? If it holds its data locally, it'd be easier for them to comply with that law than a competitor that sends out their data internationally. Laws around tax, corporation tax. Which jurisdictions is the business based in? Can it farm profits out to the most favourable jurisdiction? How might that change in the future? Again, that'll have relative implications depending upon what the business is doing at the moment. Tax in terms of R&D tax credits, different businesses in different positions. Laws around COVID, wage subsidy, furlough laws, again, had varying implications depending on the make of the workforce. Laws around Brexit, where the business traditionally sources workforce and materials. Laws around green policies and so on. Is the business ahead of the curve in relation to those? So, in fact, think about this law in this more relative way, allows us to apply our knowledge, our skills, in a much more sophisticated, strategic manner, and simply provide the same advice to every client within an industry. Now it's not being much more bespoke, much more fine-tuned. Has an impact on this business, perhaps in a slightly different manner to the competitors and other industry forces. Imagine how powerful it is if there's a new regulation and that has no direct impact on the individual business itself, but it impacts on one of its industry forces. So imagine if there's a new regulation and one sending the same newsletter with the same email to every client that has an impact on. Now we can start being a bit more bespoke. Actually, we say in the email, actually thought about this relative to your competitors. So whilst most lawyers are trained to advise our clients simply in terms of how the law will impact on them directly, most of the strategic management literature suggests that in addition to this, we think about the implications on those other industry forces. So for example, how might the new law not just directly impact on my client, but my client relative to his competitors? As we saw in Module 2 with Step 2, the strategy canvas, different businesses in the same industry commonly prioritize different customer needs. And because of that, they pursue different strategies at Step 3, and then always have a different mix of key assets at Step 4, different real estate, different locations, different mix of hardware, vehicles, so on, different financial positions, different knowledge, skills, talents of their people, different agreements with third parties, different mix of software and so on, different mix of IP, different processes, different workflow processes, and so on. Consequently then, a new law or regulation that first appears to be a costly nuisance to a business could maybe provide that business some sort of competitive advantage if it finds it easier or cheaper to comply with than the competitor, of course, because of course everything is relative. So let's say, for example, there's a new minimum wage law that looks like it's going to raise the cost of every business within an industry. That law will have less of an impact on a business that's always relied on having automated manufacturing plants and process in place to keep its costs down than will on a competitor that's always relied on having a cheap workforce to keep its costs down. And this is true in terms of any law. People often say law, that's one thing that impacts on businesses in the same way, but they never will, not unless they're startups with hardly any assets. Otherwise, they'll operate quite differently internally. Perhaps a new strict privacy law. Where does the business currently hold its data? To hold its data locally, easier to comply with this law than perhaps a competitor sends out their data internationally. Laws around tax, corporation tax. Which jurisdictions is the business based in? Can it farm profits out to the most favourable jurisdictions? How might that change in the future? R&D tax credits, different business in different position there. Laws around COVID, wage subsidy, furlough laws had relative implication depending on the makeup of the workforce and the businesses. Laws around Brexit, where the business traditionally sources workforce and materials. Laws around green policies, is the business ahead or behind the curve in relation to those sorts of things? In fact, any law will have these relative implications. So let's say there's a new regulation, and rather than sending the same newsletter out to every client has an impact on, now we can start being much more bespoke, much more fine-tuned. It has an impact on this client business, perhaps in a slightly different manner to the competitors. Perhaps now we could put a paragraph in the email to say, I've actually thought about this relative to your competitors. So one thing about if a new law just impacts on our own business, how can that impact on our competitors? So imagine a paragraph in the email to say, I've just thought about the impact on you as an individual business. How's it impact on relative to your competitors? I know from my own experience in-house counsel often viewed as be a cost center within the business who don't play a key strategic role. So perhaps we give them the ammunition to demonstrate why the law has these relative implications for the business. It's not about the impact on the business relative to its competitors. Perhaps this new regulation has no direct impact on